Hello and welcome to episode number 4 of the Nexuiz in-depth video podcast. My name is Mario Shekov, aka Green Marine, and this time I will explain what happens under the hood when you open and close Nexuiz in regard to the settings that will be saved to your config. For this, I'll explain the 3 most used elements in the config files, which is the exec for execution command, the set command, and the set_a command. Your config file, by the way, is called config.cfg, and I will explain what it contains later. On Windows, you will, by default, find it in your Nexuiz data folder at the location where you unpacked Nexuiz with your zip program. And on Linux or Mac, you have to navigate to your home folder, for example, /home/your username, and then go into the hidden folder .nexuiz and then go into the data folder to see the config file. Once you open it with a text editor, you will see all your keybinds and manipulated variables are there, which were set using a weird set_a command, but I'll come to this one in a second. Now I'll explain the exec command. The syntax for its usage is to enter exec and then the name of the config file. And this config file is just a text file. And here I've opened a sample file called test.cfg, which is located in my data folder of Nexuiz, that sets the time limit to 5, and then, in the next line, shows me a message on the console that it did that. Now in Nexuiz, when I do exec test.cfg, it will open the file and go through each line and act as if I had written the content of this line into the console myself. It will first set the time limit to 5, and then, immediately after, show me the message of the echo command. The trick is that the exec command can be nested. Here I have a config file, A, which sets some variables, and then it executes another config file, B, and then sets some more variables. Here we have the config file B that just contains a small message. When I then execute a.cfg, the lines that are executed after each other look like this. So it behaves as if the exec b.cfg was replaced by the content of file b.cfg. Now I'll explain the set command, which is used very often too. Set, followed by the name and value of the variable, creates a new variable with a specified name and value. Okay, so far so good. If the variable already existed, it will just modify its value. However, if you know the variable existed already, you don't have to write the set before, but it won't be of any harm either if you do so. Also keep in mind that it is recommended to quote the value of the variable, especially if it is a phrase that has spaces in it. For example, set my new var Hello Benjamin requires this Hello Benjamin to be quoted. If you want it, you can also provide a description for the variable, which will be shown when using the autocompletion feature of the console. To do this, provide a quoted description after the value of the variable. Now to the set_a command. Set_a works just like the set command regarding its syntax, and it will also create a new variable with the specified name, value, and description, or modify one that already existed. But what set_a additionally does is to mark the variable to be a saved variable, which means that once you close Nexuiz, it will automatically save the value to your config file, as opposed to variables created with set, which won't be saved. But keep in mind that marking a variable as saved only works if set_a created a new variable, not when modifying an existing one. This means that you can't convert an existing non-saved variable to a saved variable permanently. Let's now have a look what happens when you open Nexuiz. What happens is that the game will always open a file called quake.rc, which is also just a text file itself, and it can be found in that huge archive file in your Nexuiz data folder, which is almost 600 megabytes, and you can open that one using any zip program. It will first execute the default config of Nexuiz, which creates a lot of variables for the game, such as the damage variables for the weapons or many others, and it also creates default keybinds. After that, it loads your config file, and keep in mind, whatever is contained in your config file, it will override the variables or keybinds from the default config. Then it executes the campaign config file, which saves your personal progress in the single-player campaigns. Last but not least, it executes the file autoexec.cfg, which stands for auto-execute, and if you don't have it yet, you need to create it in your Nexuiz data folder, or when you are on Linux or Mac, you would normally create it in this /home/username/.nexuiz/data folder that I showed to you earlier. And in this file you can put anything you like, and you can be sure that all variables or keybinds you put there will be applied once the game is finished with loading. And you usually use this file to override values of variables that are normally not saved to the config. And you also use it for defining aliases, which I'll explain in another session. It is also very handy to make sure that the value of a few variables are resetted to the default value you want them to have, especially for variables that you might sometimes change during playing, such as your nickname, and you want them to be reset each time. Now you know what happens when Nexuiz starts, but what happens when Nexuiz closes? When you close the game, it will automatically use the command saveconfig, which completely rewrites your config file from scratch. By the way, you can use this saveconfig command manually by entering it into the console to make sure that variables you changed are really saved. The problem is that sometimes when Nexuiz crashes due to some problems, that saveconfig command is not called, and all changes you did to variables or keybinds since your last start, after which it crashed, will be lost. Now you might wonder, well, but what is actually being saved to the config? What is being saved are your keybinds and also the variables marked as saved that have a different value to their default value. You can check that yourself by opening the config file in a text editor, and you'll see that it contains all the variables from the advanced settings menu from the previous episode that are written in bold yellow color. What is not saved are aliases, then saved variables which already have the default value, and of course variables that are not marked to be saved. As I said previously, the saveconfig command will rewrite the config from scratch each time you close Nexuiz, which means that in many cases just putting something into your config file manually with a text editor will fail, because whatever you put in there probably affected a non-saved variable, and if this happens to you, place these changes in your auto-execute config file instead. Now you know what happens when opening and closing Nexuiz, and I hope I was able to demonstrate the config loading and saving mechanisms of the game. And I know that all this console stuff isn't as exciting at times, but it is needed as a foundation to understand upcoming tutorials. In the next episode I'll show you a few tricks how you can modify from which location these config files are loaded, which allows easy configuration for multi-user or multi-purpose environments that you never thought were possible. This was Green Marine for the Alien Trap development team. Have a good time and see you next week.